Hey, I want to be talking today about the theme of love in today's era and how I see it unraveling before my eyes. And I'm saying it that way because I really want you to take it with a grain of salt. It's hypocritical of me as someone who's skeptical of people who are trying to define an era as it's unraveling in time. And I get it. You can make predictions, you can make observations. But what I've been noticing are people who are so apt to define generations as something before they've even had a chance to do anything. And I just don't trust how people get there. We've barely gotten far enough to analyze boomers and judge their lives and their culture and their choices and the consequences of them. And I think you really need to distance yourself before you make a meaningful, substantial conclusion about a generation. So I'm aware that talking about the themes of love as they're emerging in our generation today is a smaller version of the exact thing that I'm skeptical of. All right, now, because of that, you might not want to hear what I have to say, but I think it's still fun. So let's just move on. What I want to talk about isn't a history of love. It's just a map of what love is doing in this present moment and why. And the reason I'm so fascinated with this is because I think that every era's love mirrors what I trust. People don't People don't love differently decade to decade. That doesn't make sense. I just think that love takes a different shape of whatever a culture believes in or doesn't believe in. And once it decides it doesn't believe in something, it will reattach to something else. And that's what I want to find out. That's what I want to understand. I should just throw this out there. I really don't believe that love can exist outside of a culture. Whatever society trust in is what shapes how people even understand commitment or fidelity or what intimacy is supposed to look like. Have you ever heard of the quote, "Love isn't a feeling, it's an action"? Well, what tells us to act in those certain ways? Okay, so if you want to know what love looks like in a given era, you're really asking yourself, what does that era believe is solid? Right now, I think maybe identity is more constructed and more visible to itself than it's ever been before. You see yourself on a screen, I see myself on a screen. We perform identities through these avatars of what gets watched, tracked, reacted to, and adjusted, especially if those reactions are not positive. I want to be careful with the word performative here. It doesn't mean you're fake. There's no fixed self sitting behind the performance that it's failing to live up to. There's no more honest version of you hiding beneath the surface, waiting to come out. This is the condition now. It does mean, though, that there is a gap between the self that gets witnessed, watched, and adjusted for an audience, and whatever's happening in you when no one's watching. I think that gap is where this whole thing about love exists, or begins. Out of that gap, I think there's a real longing, a real hunger for realness that's building up. People are very tired of things like, for instance, hookup culture or dating apps. And they're tired of performing for an audience, an app, and a feed. They want depth and they want to be known and they want to know others. But here's the catch, and I'm going to call my generation out. We want it fast. We want it to be organic, but rapid. We want commitment, but without the slow burn that commitment takes, and the mess and chaos that commitment requires you to tolerate. Why? I think intimacy takes time, right? So why don't people give it time? It's because the whole culture around us runs on efficiency and options. We have so many options. So we end up wanting the result of intimacy because we see that it's possible out there somewhere in someone else without doing the part that produces it with the person before us. Most of what happens romantically now sparks through mediation instead of direct encounter. I can say this from my own life. I found my partner through an app, not a dating app. It was an app where neither of us knew what we looked like at first, and we just trusted the information that we reported to each other. It's strange because my parents also had this same starting point of mediation. They learned about each other. Well, I guess it's a little different now that I think about it. But anyway, the way they got to know each other after family set them up was over the phone back in the 90s. There was no texting, so it was just calls and letters. And letters weren't romantic between them. They were mostly logistical about how to meet up and stuff. And I've written letters myself to my partner, and they were so much more sappier than anything my parents ever wrote. But I think there was just enough room for performance and BS as there could be in something else like Discord. I don't think the letter era was more honest, basically. I just think it was a different starting condition than the things we have right now. So, something still sits between two people before they meet. It's different in, I think, every condition, every app or medium to which you meet someone and mediate is a thing to analyze in another video. All right, so let's bring some literature in here because I want to use them as a way to understand the theme of the time, because it's classic literature and it got something right that people resonated with collectively. So the patterns I want to think about when I'm talking about these books are institutions, irony, mediation, and sincerity. So let's take a look at Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Anna tries to build her love outside of marriage, outside of what the social order believed to be solid, and Tolstoy does not let her survive that. And it's very brutal and devastating in the end. Levin, meanwhile, he is constantly questioning these scaffolding, the social order. He's constantly skeptical. And yet, in the end, he gives himself over to the exact things that he was skeptical of, much like me in this video. But anyway, faith. There's faith that he had to grapple with and give himself over to. Some idealized vision of his country and the conclusions he makes in the end of ordinary domesticity. And Tolstoy basically says that's what saves him. So what explains that? One of them tries to build love outside, you can't build love. Can you? I don't know. Someone tries to act in accordance to what they feel and think is love outside of the structure, and they do not make it. One submits to this social scaffolding and does make it. Love in that world was a moral choice made inside a structure that everyone had already agreed to, even the people that were also in affairs, because they weren't trying to divorce and remarry someone new. They were just trying to keep the peace on the surface with what everyone else agreed to. The scaffolding wasn't just a belief, it was belief with authority. And it settled things for people in advance. It supplied them with things to believe in. Okay. So, what happened? I don't think that meaning disappeared. I don't think structures that help us define what love looks like have disappeared. People are still getting married. People are still, holding strongly onto the idea that monogamous relationships are the most meaningful and, very skeptical of anything outside of that. So yeah, I just think that Meaning hasn't disappeared, it's just that the pre-supply of that has. Institutions used to hand couples their meaning in advance, and they don't have that kind of authority anymore. At least it's becoming less and less so. Nowadays, if a couple were to get married, they're not supplied or inheriting a ready-made meaning. They are building that relationship and what it means to them themselves from scratch every single time. Now, we should fast forward in time. Not that this is a history of love, it's just a theme of cultures and what they believe. What happens when that scaffolding is completely gone? In the 20th century, people were already running this experiment. Kundera's unbearable lightness of being happened in a time where war collapsed all of these ideals. Nobody reads The Unbearable Lightness of Being today and thinks that this detachment is aspirational, though. I think they read it as exhausting. So pure irony is something that we tried as a permanent way of loving, but eventually it fizzles out and it doesn't hold up on its own. Fast forward to now. What actually gets left is self-improvement culture, dating market logic, swiping, optimizing your profile as if you were a product. And the thing beneath all of this is that we've turned detachment into a strategy, a way of never having to get vulnerable enough to be shamed or exposed, because you were never invested enough to get out there in the first place. Just think of how people in this trend of, oh, I have a boyfriend, it's so embarrassing. Why is that? I really want you to ask yourself that. So one fair objection someone could raise here is that there's so many relationship structures today. Couples therapy, attachment theory, all of it. Personality theories that point to who you can be compatible with, temperament-wise. So is there really no scaffolding left? I'd say there's a difference between having resources to supply you meaning rather than having an authority. Couples therapy doesn't tell you what a good marriage looks like. It gives you a method, it gives you tools, it gives you language to figure that out yourself, case by case, person by person. And the old scaffolding gave you content. This is what love is. Love is Christ, who is the groom and you are the bride, or some other things outside of religion. What we have now is mostly a process, and these processes are up for debate. That's not nothing, but it's a different kind of thing. And I think it's more evidence for the thesis, not less, because even now, our new tools are built around this idea that nobody outside of the couple gets to settle it for them. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying, though. This isn't a history of individuals, whether fictional or real. People in Tolstoy's time, like I said earlier, constantly had affairs, and that was the whole point of the book, is that everyone was doing it, and somehow Anna tried to make something meaningful from it and failed. And it's sad, but plenty of people today have zero religious practices and yet are oh so devoted to their spouses and self-sacrificing as anyone in a more traditional construct ever was. I'm not saying people love differently than now. I'm saying that the stories a culture tells itself about love and the shape it treats as dominant track what a culture trusts or has stopped trusting in and where it's moving on to from here on out. So if meaning isn't handed to us anymore, it has to be built. And anything built instead of a given comes with a live question attached, which is what keeps it from collapsing. I don't think I have an answer to that. But I really am fascinated with this topic because I think it's worth sitting inside rather than resolving immediately and just mulling over it. And maybe if I did try to understand why we are we have arrived here, I would be making something up, just like the people who are so apt to define a generation and not give it a chance to prove itself as something. Yeah, anyway, so maybe I'll ask you instead, what do you think sustains love in today's day and age when it's hard to love? Is that even something we can know in the moment? Or am I right about things only being understood in hindsight? I think it's a question I have to keep asking myself too. What sustains love in the hard times, and what makes it meaningful to pursue? Anyways, I hope I gave you some food for thought. Have a good day. Bye.